So just to start, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Abigail Bender. I consider myself a science theater practitioner. I am in the last few weeks of obtaining my master's degree in science communication from Stony Brook University, and I have received a bachelor's degree in biology and theater performance from Beloit College. So before we get into the project itself, you may be thinking, science and theater, what is the point of that? So essentially, within communication research, there is fairly common knowledge of the narrative transportation theory, which essentially states that an audience member will feel more pulled in to the story and kind of will be able to change their intentions and their behavior if they feel transported or if they can connect with the narrative and such. So I have always felt that theater would be an amazing tool for this. And I had the amazing opportunity to work with a professor at Stony Brook University on a project kind of tackling this. So the project itself, this was the second rendition of the Science on Stage project. It is both times been produced by Ken Weitzman. This year, this rendition was supported from the Provost and Cash Seed Grant, the Stony Brook English Department, and the Aldous Center for Communicating Science, and the WSHU Public Radio. So that's kind of how it was broken down. The last rendition of this project was in 2020 and needs to be moved online. But we were very thankful that we got to do this in person. So here's how everything kind of folded out. So essentially we found playwrights to work with Stony Brook research scientists and to kind of collaborate with them and understand their work and them as people, and then to write these short 10-minute play drafts about either themselves or the research work they've done. And so essentially this is the timeline. It took place over a few months. The end product of this was a staged reading. So there wasn't much theatricality such as sets or movement. All the actors were on book, which means they have their script in front of them. And so essentially it was as simple as finding the playwrights, finding the scientists, making sure they had a few meetings together. Most of it was online, just kind of discussing things together. Their scripts were submitted and then we helped edit them. We had a rehearsal the day of before the stage reading itself. And then the stage reading itself took place in that evening. So this is kind of an image of our audience. We had a great turnout. We weren't in a huge theater space, but we had many professors recommend this event to their students. So we had to end up turning a lot of people away because there was just not enough space for them, unfortunately, because of fire codes. So I want to go over each of the three plays a little bit. So the first one was called The Penguin Play. It was written by Michelle Lowe, inspired by the science of Heather Lynch. She works as a penguin researcher in the marine sciences. And the play itself essentially follows a female scientist like herself talking to a funder or a potential funder who doesn't view the same way as she does. Much of her work revolves around the effects of climate change, and the funder does not see the point always. And so it's this interesting discussion trying to reach an audience that you may not agree with, and it may be kind of rough around, but still kind of trying to relate to them and trying to connect with them. The second play was called Echo. It was by Rogelio Martinez, and the science was inspired by Suparna Rajaram's. So this one was very fascinating because Suparna works her research focuses on memory and how social situations can kind of impact our final understanding of our memory and like where we land. So essentially, there are a handful of characters in this piece. We're kind of going back and forth, trying to debate and agree on what happened after a night, what happened at the end of a night. They left a party and they were discussing the death of someone and they were trying to get their story straight, essentially. And the final show is called Prometheus, the Modern Frankenstein. This was written by Greg Cotis. The science was inspired by Nilanjan Chakrabarti. I'm so sorry if I mispronounced that. But this one was very fascinating because Nilanjan's research focuses on AI and machine learning. And similar to the original Frankenstein story of it being kind of a a warning or like a story, a cautionary tale. That's the word I'm looking for. So it being kind of a cautionary tale around certain sciences, and we're at a space with AI in the world where we're all kind of wary in different ways. It follows the original Mr. and Mrs. Frankenstein from the book talking to a scientist character based on the Long John, talking about AI and asking questions and kind of in a semi-comical sense trying to tackle this fear many people have, and the scientist character trying to put us in our place and trying to really get to the main point of AI. It's not going to take over the world as we see it currently. So after these three performances, there was a talkback that occurred with the researchers and the playwrights. It was very fascinating to hear about their perspectives of working together and kind of what they all took away from this experience and what they enjoyed and how they would proceed. So I wanted to get feedback not only from this talkback, but I reached out to all the individuals and just to see how different groups kind of were looking at things. So I talked to the playwrights, the scientists, and the actors to see kind of what this experience was like for them. And I wanted to go over some of those findings with you. So sharing your research through performance, first we're going to tackle the scientists' thoughts on this. So the first was having the spotlight turn on you versus your work for the story behind the story. So essentially, this comes from a comment from Heather Lynch, where she kind of talked to me about how she's had her work kind of put up in creative ways before, not necessarily in a theater setting like this, but she's never really had it turned on her as a researcher before. Like the stories always followed her work with penguins typically, and it's often aimed at a much younger audience. But she was fascinated by kind of watching herself or someone mirroring herself essentially right in front of her. The second was how your work is naturally situated for different audiences. So, like I said a moment ago, Heather Lynch's work with penguins tends to be adapted to focus on younger audiences because kids love penguins. And just like seeing how the playwrights were able to take a different approach to the story, or some of the playwrights talked about how they really felt like it was easy to write more for an adult audience. And then explaining your research to a playwright. So it was not as simple as handing over their research papers to the playwrights and having the playwrights completely understand it. So it was very interesting. Each pair kind of had a different way. We didn't structure how they collaborated. So some would talk to each other and like try to get to know each other's people. And some would send papers, and then Suparna sent papers, and then the playwright she was working with would send her plays back to read. So it was a very interesting give and take with a lot of the sides. So then writing outside your field, I wanted to look at the playwright's thoughts. So one, how to make quantitative research entertaining. So if you've ever looked at a research paper, it's not always the most dazzling thing. So just really digging in and trying to find like the little nuggets of information that you can turn into a narrative story, like going around that different way to look at the researcher themselves, since we are humans, or finding like the research and like the purpose and like why you're studying it and how you can like apply it to different situations. And working directly with the scientists, this was a first experience for many of the playwrights. And I think it was a positive one. I heard a lot of good things. And yeah, I think they really enjoyed it and wanted to do it again. I think if people really in general wanted more time to work with people, it was kind of a short project. And then kind of exploring this gray zone that sits between science and theater, because some of the playwrights discuss this, and I inherently believe this also, that science itself can be fairly dramatic. And just with how you test things and it fails, and then you have to try different things, and then there's interpolitics and like just things you have to navigate. And so just kind of going along with how to make quantitative research entertaining, like finding that gray zone of like what's going to work, what's going to not. So, and then finally, I wanted to talk to the actors. So something that came out of those discussions were performing as scientific characters. Some of them had worked on not the same project, but similar projects where they performed as scientific characters. And some felt like it was just like a normal part of acting, like you pick up a character, you try to get to know them. But some who had never done this before thought it was very fascinating and very fun. Getting insights from the scientists during the read through. So during our rehearsal before the staged reading, the scientists who were available sat in with us, and they could answer questions for the actors, and really help them understand like more. This was really helpful, especially since we had very little rehearsal time. I think in general, the feedback I got was that they wish they could have talked to the scientists more. And then narrative themes within scientific research. This kind of goes off the same thing with the playwright's thoughts on kind of figuring out how to make scientific research entertaining. But since the actors were kind of just stepping in with these narrative themes existing, it was kind of for a handful, it was like this eye-opening experience of seeing like, oh, this can exist, instead of how do I make this happen. So I just wanted to share some audience responses. I talked to a few people after the show, and I just thought these were some really fun quotes. So one person said, it was a great way to reel people in and put aside super technical jargon. Cool to understand and interesting how it engaged you in the story. And somebody told me it was the first time seeing science presented this way and that they were in awe. So that just warms my heart and makes me feel like that this theater truly is a path to reaching people who may not be entrenched in like the jargon or the technical world of science. Like it can be made accessible through story. So what does this mean for theater engagement with researchers and the best practices? So essentially, what I took away from the discussion with the different participants was that in general, pretty much everyone just wanted more time to work with each other. This was a pretty short project, and in general, so there's like a time crunch that we kind of had to work around. But in the future or for future projects, like the more scientists get to engage with the people who are a part of the process, it seemed that the people on the creative end were really enjoying and thankful for that. And it helped kind of deepen their understanding of the characters and helped which is so important in like a staged reading when you don't have costumes or sets and you don't have months to like understand the character. Having those kind of extra insights from the researcher themselves can be very helpful. So the future of this work specifically, as I said at the beginning, I am finishing my master's program. So I definitely see Ken Weitzman continuing this project in the future at Stony Brook. But I am just glad I had the opportunity to work on this version, this rendition of the project. It was amazing. All the actors, the playwrights, the scientists were all amazing to talk to and all incredibly kind and excited about the process. So in the future, I hope to be in the audience watching this happen again. Thank you so much. I am happy to talk to anyone. This is my email and my portfolio website with other science theater stuff I've done. So please reach out. Love to hear from you.